Did you hear the news this morning? A young African president just stood before the world, locked eyes with Trum, and said what the world has been too afraid to say for far too long. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't a leak. It was real, and it just shook global politics to its core. Not everyone has the guts to do that, but Ibraim Trrowé did. President of Burkina Vaso, barely past 30, dressed in his military uniform, calm and unshaken among a sea of designer suits. A man from a country the media rarely mentions yet. Today, all eyes were on him. It happened at the Global Leadership Summit in Geneva, a gathering of the most powerful people on Earth. Presidents, prime ministers, billionaires and tech titans sat shoulder to shoulder beneath chandeliers that cost more than most villages. They came to talk about peace, growth, and the future of humanity, at least on paper. But no one expected something real to happen. Trrowé didn't show up to network. He showed up to make the room hold its breath. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear might just make history. Just minutes after the summit began, the stage lights dimmed and the first major speaker stepped forward. It was Trum, known globally for his brash tone, unpredictable statements and unapologetic opinions. Wearing his trademark suit and confident grin, he looked around the grand hall filled with world leaders, paused for dramatic effect, and dropped a line that would send shockwaves far beyond those walls. "When you look at Africa," he said casually, "you just see chaos and corruption. You don't know who's running what. Honestly, it's a mess. Total disaster." A few awkward chuckles rippled through the room. Some leaders shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to laugh, object, or pretend they hadn't heard it. A few nodded, perhaps out of habit or fear of drawing attention. Cameras blinked. Eyes darted. The marble floors and golden chandeliers suddenly felt colder, heavier. But in the far side of the room, Ibrahim Trrowé didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't look around to see who was watching. Instead, he stood, slowly, calmly, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The shuffle of his boots on the polished floor was almost too loud. In the stunned silence, a few heads turned, then more. Security stiffened slightly. Journalists reached for their pens. One by one, eyes began to track him as he made his way toward the center aisle. Not rushing, not hesitating. Each step had weight. Each step said enough. When he reached the front, he stopped just short of the podium. He didn't grab the microphone. He didn't adjust his collar. He simply looked at Trum, held his gaze and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Trum, you have no idea what Africa truly is." The room froze. You could almost hear hearts skip. Heads turned so fast it was audible. Some gasped quietly. Others instinctively reached for their phones. The media booth lit up in red record lights. Trrowé wasn't yelling. He wasn't even angry, but in that one sentence he'd cracked open a silence that had lasted for decades. His uniform stood out stark against the backdrop of tuxedos and navy suits. The flag of Burkina Vaso on his chest gleamed under the lights. His posture was firm, unshaken, as though the weight of generations had settled on his shoulders, but instead of buckling, he stood taller. All cameras pointed at him now. All whispers had stopped. What began as another diplomatic gathering had shifted. The air was no longer heavy with protocol. It was charged with truth, with tension, with something that felt alive. Then Trrowé took one small step forward, not toward Trum, but toward the center of the room. The space opened before him like a stage, and with every eye locked on his presence, he began to speak. Not in anger, not with fire, but with clarity. So sharp it cut deeper than any shout could. Africa is not chaos. Africa is not corruption. Africa is history. Africa is resilience. The room stayed silent, but it wasn't the silence of discomfort anymore. It was the kind that comes when people realize they're witnessing something they can't look away from. Trrowé didn't glance at his notes. He had none. His voice was steady, his words precise, like he wasn't speaking to the room, but through it, to something older, bigger. When your ancestors arrived on our soil, They didn't find chaos, they found civilizations. Gold wisdom. Kingdoms that traded, healed, taught, and lived in balance. What came after was not partnership, it was plunder. He paused. You drew borders with no regard for language, tribe, or history. You enslaved generations, and when we finally won our independence, we inherited systems that were never designed to serve us. They were built to fail. A flicker of discomfort crossed some faces, others leaned forward. The truth was raw. It scraped off the diplomatic polish and exposed the scaffolding of hypocrisy underneath. Yes, we have problems, Trrowé continued, but let me ask you why. Because your phones run on our minerals, your desserts are sweetened by our cocoa, your cars and factories are fueled by our oil. He paused again, letting the contrast hang in the air like smoke. And in return, our children eat once a day if they're lucky. Our youth walk streets with degrees in hand and no jobs to go to. Our hospitals lack medicine while our resources fill your vaults. A few leaders looked down. Others exchanged uneasy glances. No one interrupted. No one dared. You call us corrupt, he said slowly. But what do you call the Western companies who pay bribes to steal what's ours? What do you call the tax havens where African billions disappear? The banks that welcome the wealth of our dictators? The silence when wars erupt over contracts signed in your boardrooms? Now even the journalists, seasoned, detached, were scribbling faster. Trrowé hadn't raised his voice once, but the walls seemed to echo with the weight of everything unsaid for decades. He wasn't there to accuse blindly. He was holding up a mirror, one the world had tried not to look into, and still he spoke without bitterness. Just truth. Truth that didn't ask for sympathy. It demanded reckoning. And outside those walls in cities and villages across Africa, millions would soon hear these words and realize they'd just been spoken, not behind closed doors, but in the heart of power itself. Trrowé let the silence settle for just a moment longer, long enough for the truth he'd spoken to echo in the bones of every person in the room. Then with a softer voice and a steady breath he said, "Let me tell you a story, a real one." His tone shifted, not to plead, not to dramatize, but to bring something personal into a room where policy too often forgets people. There's a boy in a small village in Burkina Faso. His name is Malik. He's 12 years old. The name alone carried weight. He wasn't a statistic. He wasn't a headline. He was someone's child. Every morning before the sun rises, Malik wakes up. He doesn't get ready for school. He grabs a plastic container and walks, 6 miles barefoot. Not to explore, not to play, to fetch water for his mother and younger siblings. Trrowé paused. Not for effect, but because you could hear a pin drop. No movement, no shifting chairs, no camera clicks. On the way he passes gold mines, shining hills of wealth. Gold that leaves our soil and ends up in your jewelry stores, your smartphones, your private vaults. Gold he'll never touch. Someone near the front wiped their eyes. Trum sat still, expression unreadable. When Malik returns, he eats one small meal, sometimes none. Then by candlelight, if there's wax left, he studies. He doesn't dream of Europe. He doesn't dream of escaping. He dreams of becoming an engineer. Not to leave Africa, but to rebuild it. To dig wells, so no child has to walk 6 miles like he does. To build roads and hospitals, so his village can live with dignity. There was a long pause, and then Trrowé said, "That boy's dream is not a visa. It's not a plane ticket. It's justice. It's dignity." A collective breath passed through the audience. Some looked down. Others looked at him and saw not just a president, but a man carrying the weight of every child like Malik. Even the journalists trained to detach from emotions seemed to falter. One woman lowered her pen. Another wiped her glasses, but she wasn't cleaning them. And still, Trrowé stood firm, not breaking, not blinking. His voice barely raised yet. It filled the space more than any speech before. You ask why we're angry, but the truth is, we're not angry. We're awake. Malik doesn't need pity. He needs power. He needs opportunity. He needs a world that doesn't steal his future before he even has a chance to live it. That final line lingered, not just in the air, but in the chest. It wasn't just about Malik. It was about millions. It was about every child the world forgets until they grow up with nothing left to give. And right there in a hall meant for handshakes and hollow promises, Trrowé handed back a truth no one could unhear. The story of Malik hadn't just touched hearts, it had shaken something deeper. But Trrowé wasn't done. He had stirred the room with pain. Now he would confront it with truth. He turned to face the global leaders in front of him, not as a politician begging for aid, but as a man holding up a mirror. And what he said next made even the back row lean in. "You talk about corruption," he began. "You use the word as though it belongs to us, but it was built by you." Some shifted in their seats, others froze. "It's not born in dusty villages, it's protected in your banks. It's written into your legal contracts, it's hidden in tax havens you designed." A few advisors glanced nervously at one another. But Trrowé continued, voice calm, eyes unblinking. "Money stolen from Africa doesn't sit in Africa. It sits in your cities, under your lights, in your glass towers. Corruption doesn't begin in Kinshasa. It begins in Brussels, in Washington, in Dubai." The words didn't echo. They landed. "You point fingers at our leaders who take bribes, but who pays them? Western oil companies, mining giants, arms dealers. You judge us for weakness, but you built the chains." Then he lifted his hand slightly, as if pulling the curtain open wider. "Right now, as I speak, children in Burkina Vaso are digging for gold with bare hands. That gold will never pay for their schools. It will line the pockets of men in Geneva. A boy like Malik walks past those mines every morning, but his father died in one. Buried alive in a collapse, no one reported working for a foreign firm that left the country without even an apology. His school has no roof, his dreams have no protection. And still, we are told to be patient." He stopped briefly and looked across the room as if daring someone to deny it. That boy doesn't need pity. He needs power. Not a charity drive, not a hashtag. He needs the world to stop stealing what was never theirs. Comment. 1. If you believe Trrowé speaks the truth, the world keeps ignoring. You say, Africa has failed, but how can a tree grow if you keep cutting its roots? Every time we rise, you shift the rules. Every time we build, you change the game. Every time we dream, you buy the soil under our feet. A quiet gasp rose from somewhere in the middle. No one laughed. No one dared. Africa was never allowed to succeed. Trrowé said, his voice lower now but heavier, as if carrying centuries behind every syllable. From colonial flags to IMF loans, from rigged contracts to stolen voices, we were handed a broken system and blamed for the cracks. He paused, letting the silence settle. We are demanding space to breathe, to create, to rise. His words weren't loud, but they echoed louder than any anthem sung at that summit. This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a reckoning. The hall was no longer the same room it had been an hour ago. Something irreversible had just happened, and then came the words that sealed it. We are not asking for permission. Africa is ready to stand. And I, Ibraim Trrowé, will stand first. It was quiet for a second, then a single clap, then two, then all at once the room erupted. Presidents from Latin America stood first, eyes bright with something more than respect. Ministers from Asia followed, hands raised in applause. Even among the European delegation, a few rose slowly, as if realizing they had just witnessed not a speech, but a shift in history. Some clapped hesitantly, others with conviction, but the standing ovation swept the room like a wave no one could stop. Cameras flashed. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Social media feeds lit up before the summit had even ended. Within minutes, the hashtag #TroSpeaks truth was trending, first in Nairobi, then Johannesburg, then Lagos. By the hour's end, it had crossed oceans, appearing on phones in Sao Paulo, London and New York. Clips of Traoré's speech flooded timelines. One video showing the moment he said, "Africa was never allowed to succeed," hit 1 million views before he even left the building. The impact was seismic. In universities across Africa, students gathered in dorm rooms and cafeterias to re-watch the moment. Some stood silently, others cheered. In Ghana, a political science class stopped mid-lecture to project the speech onto a whiteboard. In Nigeria, a rapper dropped a freestyle titled "Stand First," using Traoré's closing line as the chorus. In Kenya, a school teacher printed the entire transcript and handed it out as a reading assignment. "This," she told her students, "is what courage looks like." In Senegal, a street artist painted a mural overnight. Traoré, standing tall, surrounded by children holding books and tools instead of guns. The words, "Not waiting," "Rising" were scrawled across the sky. Even beyond Africa, the reaction was staggering. International journalists rewrote headlines. Traoré challenges, Trum and wins, the world's respect, from military jacket to global symbol. Burkina Faso's leader sparks a movement. Influencers, activists, and thinkers who had long been silent on African affairs were now quoting him, tagging his name, dissecting his speech. People who had never even heard of Burkina Vaso were Googling it, curious to know more. The shock wasn't that Traoré had spoken. It was that he had spoken so clearly and the world had finally listened. And back home, the response was electric. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets. Some waved flags, others held up phones playing the speech on repeat. Murals appeared overnight, T-shirts with Traoré's face and the words, "Tro speaks." Truth sold out in hours. Children reenacted moments of the speech at school assemblies. Local radio played audio clips between music. Elders spoke his name with pride. Youth carried it like fire. He didn't just speak for himself, one caller said on a live broadcast. He spoke for Malik, for my son, for all of us. And the movement didn't end with applause. A week later, Traoré announced a new initiative, Africa First. The goals were bold, direct. Keep African resources in African hands. End exploitative contracts with foreign corporations. Enforce real anti-corruption measures even within his own administration. Create scholarship programs, startup funds, and youth empowerment projects. Investigate illegal offshore accounts and bring stolen wealth back home. Suddenly, other nations took notice. Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, even oil-rich Nigeria sent delegations to Burkina Vaso. They weren't coming to offer help, they were coming to join. "We are not poor," a leader said at a regional summit. "We are rich nations with stolen futures. It's time we take them back." And at the center of it all was Traoré, once dismissed as a populist, now called a visionary. And to many, something more. He is the African lion, a young woman in Dakar tweeted. Not because he roars, but because he protects. Across the continent, artists, educators, workers and children embraced that image. Traoré wasn't perfect, but he was present. He had shown up in the room when no one expected him to speak, and spoke so no one could ever forget. And while Trum refused to comment further, the truth was it no longer mattered. The spotlight had shifted. The center had moved. Africa was not asking to be saved. It was standing. It was building. And now it was being heard. But Traoré didn't stop after the applause. The moment he left the summit stage, his next steps were already in motion. The speech in Geneva had made history, yes, but when the cameras turned away and the headlines faded, he returned to the dust, the desks, the broken systems, still standing in his country, and that's where real leadership began. The Africa First initiative moved from vision to action. Traoré pushed through new mining laws that prioritized local ownership. He signed anti-corruption legislation that held even his closest allies accountable. He launched national youth programs funding startups, training engineers, and expanding scholarships for those like Malik, who dreamed with nothing but candlelight. But the initiative wasn't just domestic, it sent shockwaves across the continent. From Ghana to Ethiopia, from Senegal to Nigeria, governments began reviewing their own contracts. Leaders who once whispered their frustrations about foreign control were now speaking openly, quoting Traoré's words. And more importantly, they were acting. What made it different this time wasn't just policy, it was belief. The belief that Africa didn't have to imitate anyone, that it didn't need permission to reclaim what was always its own. But Trrowé never claimed to be the answer. He was the start of a question, one the youth would have to finish. In speeches and interviews he reminded everyone, "I can't fix Africa. No single leader can, but I can light the torch and hand it to you," and they took it. In cities, villages, classrooms and markets, people stopped waiting. They created, they organized, they questioned, they built. The continent had not been cured overnight, but it had awakened. The world looked on, unsure whether to cheer or prepare. Because something had shifted, Africa was not asking. She was moving, and this time she was not moving quietly. Not with noise, not with anger, but with clarity, with purpose, and with eyes wide open. Africa is not asking to be seen anymore. She is standing, and this time she will not step back. Subscribe to our channel to follow the real stories of Trrowé and Africa's awakening. Every time he speaks, the world listens. See you in the next story, where truth always finds its voice. Et il ne s'est pas arrêté à ce discours. Quelques semaines seulement après le sommet de Genève, le président Ibrahim Traoré a lancé ce qu'il a appelé l'initiative Africa First Son Objectif. Clair et audacieux, garder les ressources africaines entre des mains africaines. Le programme incluait de nouveaux contrats avec des entreprises locales pour l'extraction et la transformation de l'or, du pétrole et d'autres minéraux. Des lois anticorruption strictes avec des mécanismes d'application concrets, y compris contre les membres de son propre gouvernement. Des programmes d'émancipation des jeunes proposant des bourses, des fonds pour start-up et des formations en agriculture, technologie et éducation. Et une task force continentale chargée d'enquêter sur les transferts illégaux de richesses et de rapatrier les actifs volés depuis les comptes à l'étranger. Et voici la partie la plus incroyable: des dizaines d'autres pays africains ont exprimé leur volonté de rejoindre l'initiative. Le Ghana, le Mali, la Tanzanie, l'Éthiopie et même le Nigeria, riche en pétrole, ont commencé à envoyer des délégations à Ouagadougou pour discuter de partenariat. Des dirigeants qui autrefois opéraient dans la peur d'offenser les puissances étrangères se mettaient à parler avec une nouvelle confiance. Lors d'un panel télévisé, l'un d'eux déclara « Nous ne sommes pas pauvres, nous sommes des nations riches à qui l'on a volé l'avenir. Il est temps de le reprendre. » Ibraim Trrowé, autrefois moqué par les critiques occidentaux comme un populiste militaire, était désormais qualifié de visionnaire. Et parmi la jeunesse, il devenait légendaire. On l'appelait le lion africain. Pas parce qu'il était violent, pas parce qu'il voulait la guerre, mais parce qu'il était sans peur, déterminé et protecteur. À travers tout le continent, des enfants portaient des t-shirts à son effigie avec l'inscription Africa First. Des fresques murales à son image apparaissaient dans les écoles et les places publiques. Des musiciens écrivaient des chansons en son honneur, célébrant l'homme qui avait donné une nouvelle voix à l'Afrique. Et pourtant, Trrowé restait humble. Dans l'un de ses discours ultérieurs, il déclara « Je ne suis qu'un homme. Je ne peux pas sauver l'Afrique, mais je peux lui rappeler sa force. Le vrai changement ne viendra pas de moi, il viendra du peuple, des jeunes, des mères, des agriculteurs, des enseignants, des bâtisseurs. » Il termina ce discours par des mots qui allaient être imprimés sur des affiches dans tout le continent. « Nous n'attendons plus, nous nous levons. » Et ils se sont levés, pas avec violence, pas avec haine, mais avec vision, unité et dignité. Ibrahim Traoré avait fait plus que confronter une superpuissance mondiale. Il avait allumé un feu, un mouvement d'esprit et de cœur. Et bien que la route devant soit difficile, une chose était désormais certaine. L'Afrique avait retrouvé sa voie et le monde ne serait plus jamais le même. Parfois, il suffit d'une seule voix pour réveiller des millions. Les mots d'Ibraim Trrowé ont secoué le monde, non pas parce qu'il a attaqué, mais parce qu'il a défendu quelque chose de plus grand. À une époque de jeu de pouvoir et de politique, il nous a rappelé ce qu'est le vrai leadership, le courage, la vérité et l'amour sincère pour son peuple. Et que vous soyez d'accord ou non avec lui, une chose est désormais indiscutable. L'Afrique est en train de se lever, et elle ne demande plus la permission.